She was 20 years old and standing at a lawyer's desk in a town that had never bothered to learn her face. And when the will was read, she found that her father had left her no house, no money, no name worth speaking, only a frozen lake at the far edge of Willow Hollow that nobody in the county wanted. She had a canvas satchel, $38, and a small brass compass that had once belonged to her mother. And with that $38 and that compass, she went out to see the lake he had chosen to leave her, instead of everything else. But what nobody in Willow Hollow knew, and what Anna Mercer herself did not yet know, was that beneath the ice of that useless lake, there was the outline of a cabin, sealed and waiting, and that cabin was the reason her father had left her nothing else. Settle in with a warm drink. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and stay close, because this story unfolds slowly and every detail matters. Anna Mercer had been born in a rented room above a feed store in a town 2 valleys east of Willow Hollow, and her mother had died before she was old enough to hold a clear memory of her face, leaving behind only the brass compass, a wedding photograph the size of a playing card, and a stitched sampler that read, "Be steady" in small blue thread. Her father, Thomas Mercer, was a quiet man who took work where he could find it, mending harness, timbering in the late fall, laying stone for other people's foundations, and he raised Anna the way a man raises a child he loves but does not know how to speak to, which meant he fed her and clothed her and taught her the names of trees, and did not tell her anything about where he had come from, or why he never took her back across the ridge to the country he had grown up in. He kept a locked tin box on the top shelf of every rented cupboard they ever owned, and Anna learned early not to ask about it, the way a child learns not to touch a stove. They moved often, always west, always into smaller towns, and by the time Anna was 12, they had settled in a 2-room cabin at the edge of a ranch owned by a woman named Hetty Corrigan, a widow of 63 who ran 40 head of cattle by herself and had buried both her sons in the same winter of a bad fever. Hetty took one look at Anna, standing in the yard in a coat too thin for the weather, and told Thomas that the girl would work for her after school and be paid in coin and skill, and Thomas, who never argued with people who were kinder than he expected, agreed. For the next 6 years, Hetty Corrigan taught Anna everything a woman needs to know to live alone in hard country. She taught her to split kindling with a short-handled axe, and to read the sky for the kind of storm that kills stock. She taught her to trap and to skin, to cure hides in the shed behind the smokehouse, to mend a barbed wire fence in the dark with only the feel of the wire against a gloved palm. She taught her to keep a ledger, to write a clean receipt, to speak to a man who was trying to cheat her without raising her voice, and to walk away from that same man before her temper found her tongue. Hetty was not affectionate in any way a stranger would recognize, but she kept a chair pulled out for Anna at her kitchen table every evening, and she once, and only once, laid a rough hand on the crown of Anna's head and said, "You're the steady kind. That's rarer than you think." Hetty died in her sleep the winter Anna was 18, and the ranch passed to a nephew in the east who sold the herd, dismissed the hands, and boarded up the house within a season. Anna and Thomas moved into a smaller cabin nearer the road, and Thomas began to cough in a way that neither of them named for what it was. He worked less. He sat longer by the stove. He would sometimes take the tin box down from the shelf and hold it on his knees without opening it. And once Anna came in from the woodpile and found him staring at it with tears running quietly into his beard. And when she asked him what was in it, he only shook his head and said, "Willow Hollow, girl. Only Willow Hollow." She did not know the name. He would not explain it. And by the following autumn, he was too weak to leave his chair, and by the first snow he was gone. and Anna sat alone in the cabin with the tin box on the table in front of her, and the brass compass in her palm, and a stillness in her chest that she had learned from Hetty Corrigan and did not intend to break. The compass she carried came from her mother, but the habit of carrying it came from Hetty, who had told her that a person walking into unfamiliar country ought to know which way home was, even when there was no home to walk back to. It was a small thing, brass, dented on one edge from a fall Anna did not remember, with a glass face scratched to a fog and a needle that still swung true. She kept it in the inner pocket of her coat, against her ribs, and when she was frightened, she pressed her hand flat against the outside of the pocket and felt the round shape of it, and that was enough, most days, to keep her steady. She had held it like that at Hetty's grave. She had held it like that at her father's, and she was holding it, without knowing she was holding it. The afternoon a lawyer she had never met wrote to say that Thomas Mercer had left affairs to be settled, and that she was to come to a town called Willow Hollow, 3 days' ride to the north, to hear what her father had left her, which the letter warned her, in careful legal English, was not likely to be much. She answered the letter the way Hetty had taught her to answer any summons from a man with a desk, which was to answer promptly, in writing, and to arrive when she said she would arrive. She sold what she could not carry, which was not much, and what she could not sell she gave to a neighbor woman 2 roads over who had 4 children and a broken pump. She kept the tin box, though it was still locked, and she had no key for it, and she kept the sampler folded flat at the bottom of her satchel, and she kept the wedding photograph pressed inside the pages of the small account book Hetty had once made her keep, and she kept the compass in the inner pocket of her coat, against her ribs, where it had always ridden. The rest of her father's life fit into the canvas satchel, with room left over for a wedge of hard cheese and a paper twist of salt. She counted her money on the table the night before she left. It came to $38. She put the coins into a small drawstring pouch, and the pouch into the satchel and the satchel by the door, and then she sat by the cold stove until the light came, because she had learned long ago that a house without a person in it is only a room, and she wanted to sit inside her father's house 1 more hour before it became only a room. In the morning, she rode north with a hired man going as far as the second river, and after the second river, she walked. She reached Willow Hollow on the 3rd afternoon, dust on her boots and her braid gone loose under her hat, and she found the lawyer's office above a dry goods store on the main street, up an outside staircase that creaked in a way that made her think of Hetty's back porch. The lawyer was a thin man of perhaps 50 with reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead and a stack of papers weighted down by a river stone. He asked her to sit. He asked her name twice to be certain of the spelling, and he wrote it down. Then he read her the will. It was a short document. Thomas Mercer, of no fixed address, being of sound mind, left to his daughter Anna Mercer the entirety of his estate, which consisted of 1 parcel of land at the far northern edge of Willow Hollow Township, described by survey number and by the plain words, a lake, frozen 10 acres, no improvements standing. There was no house. There was no money. There was no explanation. The lawyer laid the paper flat on the desk and turned it toward her so she could see the survey number and the plain words for herself, and he watched her face in the way men watch the faces of young women who have just been told a thing that might be expected to make them cry. Anna did not cry. She read the words twice. She asked quietly whether there was anything else. The lawyer said there was not. She asked whether the parcel had any debts against it, any taxes owing, any liens or claims, and the lawyer, surprised by the question, checked his file and said no. It was clear. Her father had paid the small yearly tax on it every year of her life without fail. She heard that, and did not let it show on her face. But she filed it away as one files a receipt one intends to look at later. She asked for the survey map. He gave it to her. She thanked him. She walked back down the creaking stair and out into the cold street, and she stood for a moment with the folded map in one hand and the satchel over her shoulder, and she did what Hetty had taught her to do when a bad hand had been dealt, which was to look at the cards she still held rather than the ones she did not. She still held $38. She still held the compass. She still held 2 good boots and a wool coat and the knowledge of how to read a sky. She asked at the livery for the road to the far northern edge of the township, and the man there looked at her a long moment before he answered. And when he answered, he did not ask her business, which she took as a kindness. He told her to follow the creek road out past the last fence and to bear left at the split pine. And after that, he said, she would know the lake when she saw it, because there was nothing else out that way to see. She thanked him and paid him a nickel for a fresh canteen of water and started walking before the light began to slide. The road out of Willow Hollow ran between low stone walls for a mile, and then between rail fences for another mile, and then between nothing at all, only winter grass gone the color of old rope and the black shapes of leafless cottonwoods along a creek that ran too fast to freeze in its middle. The wind came down off the ridge in long, even breaths, cold enough to sting the inside of her nose, and she walked into it steadily, her hat pulled low, her satchel riding light on her hip, her hand every so often pressing flat against her ribs to feel the round shape of the compass against her coat. She passed a homestead, with smoke rising thin and blue from its chimney, and a dog that barked once at her and then thought better of it. She passed a shed with a caved roof and a wagon frame stripped of its wheels. She passed the last fence and the split pine, and beyond the split pine, the road narrowed to a track, and beyond the track it became only the memory of a track. 2 ruts in the grass where wagons had rolled long enough ago that the grass had begun to reclaim them. The country opened. The ridge to her right rose into a dark line of firs. The ridge to her left fell away into a shallow bowl, and in the bowl she saw the lake before she was ready to see it. Flat and white and impossibly still, ringed by black timber, and she stopped where she was and stood a long moment with the wind pushing at her back and the sky going the pale gray of a mourning dove above her. And she understood, without needing to be told, that she was looking at everything her father had left her in the world. She stood there until the wind reminded her that standing did not keep a body warm, and then she went down into the bowl. The slope was gentle, matted with dead bunchgrass and pocked with the small, clean tracks of deer, and it brought her out at the eastern edge of the lake, where a broken run of stones marked what had once been a shoreline path. She followed the stones. The lake was larger up close than it had looked from above, near enough to the 10 acres the survey named, roughly oval, its long axis running north and south, its far shore a smudge of black timber and gray brush. The ice was thick and old, a milky greenish blue at the shore where the reeds went down through it, deepening to a darker glass toward the middle, scoured clean of snow in patches by the wind and drifted in soft crescents where the wind eddied. She walked out onto it a few steps, tested it with her heel the way Hetty had taught her, heard the low, solid sound of ice that had been there since November at least, and then she walked farther. She saw the cabin when she was perhaps 30 feet from shore. She had been watching her boots and the pale swirls of frozen air trapped in the ice, and then the ice went dark under her, and she stopped, and the darkness resolved itself into a shape she knew. It was a small square cabin, the roof pitched low, the 4 walls squared and true, lying not tipped or broken, but sitting upright on the bed of the lake, as though the water had risen around it in a single patient tide and closed over it without ever disturbing a shingle. She could make out the ridge of the roof, the darker rectangle of a doorway on the near side, the paler stripe of what she thought was a chimney of set stone standing along the west wall, and the ghost of a step at the door. The timbers looked whole. The stones of the chimney had held. Whatever else the lake had taken, it had not taken the shape of the place. Anna knelt on the ice, pressed one gloved palm flat against it, and looked. The cabin was perhaps 10 or 12 feet below her, near enough that she could count the rows of the shingles and see where a shutter had once hung and been carried off. She saw no glass in the windows, only the black squares of open framing. She saw, along the west wall, a lean-to that had partly collapsed inward, its roof pole angling down like a broken arm. And she saw, along the south side of the cabin, laid in a neat line as if someone had set them there for a day's work, 4 stones the size of loaves, dressed and squared. Her father had laid stone. She had watched him work. The corners of those 4 stones were cut the way he cut corners. She stayed on her knees longer than the cold allowed. When she stood, her legs were stiff, and her eyes had gone hot in a way she did not permit them to finish, and she turned back toward the shore because she needed to be off the ice before the light went. She walked slowly, keeping the line of the cabin at her back, marking in her mind the bearing from the eastern point where the stone path came down. When she reached the shore, she took the compass from her coat and set it in her palm and let the needle settle, and she wrote the bearing on the back of the survey map with a stub of pencil, because Hetty had also taught her that memory was a poor witness against weather. Only then did she look up the shore, and only then did she see that the bowl had held more than a lake. Set into the hillside above the eastern point, half swallowed by earth and bramble, was a small stone dugout, no bigger than a pantry, its front wall built of the same dressed stones lying under water along the cabin's south side. Its door was gone. Its lintel had held. Its roof, turfed over and grown through with grass, sagged, but had not fallen. Anna went up the slope to it, because a dugout above a flooded cabin was too plain a thing not to have been meant. She had to bend to enter. Inside, the air was still and dry, and smelled of old earth and juniper, and the faint mineral cold of stone that had never been warmed by a stove. The room was perhaps 6 feet by 8, floored with flat slate, walled in cut stone up to a height of 4 feet, and in squared timbers above that. 2 shelves ran along the back wall, and on the shelves sat what a root cellar keeps: a row of empty crocks, a rusted lantern, a coil of tarred twine, a whetstone, and at the far end, a small tin box, the shape and size of the one her father had kept on the top shelf of every cupboard they had ever owned. The box was not locked. The hasp had long since gone to rust and let go. Anna did not open it at once. She sat down on the slate floor with her back against the cold stone and took her gloves off and set them on her knee. And she waited until her hands were steady, because she wanted her hands to be steady when she lifted the lid. When she lifted it, the hinge whispered like a small dry leaf, and inside she saw first a folded square of oilcloth, and under the oilcloth a canvas pouch heavier than it looked, and under the pouch a folded sheet of paper that had been pressed flat by the weight of both. She lifted them out one at a time and laid them on the slate in the order she had found them. The pouch held coins. She counted them slowly, laying them in short stacks on the oilcloth. 17 gold half-eagles, a handful of silver dollars, a scattering of quarters and dimes worn smooth. She counted twice. It came to just over $140, more money than she had ever held in her life, more money than her father had ever held at one time in hers. Under the coins, wrapped in a smaller piece of the oilcloth, lay a woman's wedding ring, a plain gold band worn thin on the inside, and a lock of dark hair tied with a scrap of blue thread the color of the thread in the sampler at the bottom of her satchel. She held the thread against the light from the doorway and could not tell the two blues apart. Then she unfolded the paper. It had been folded in thirds and creased so long that the creases had gone soft. The writing was small and careful, done in a hand that had learned its letters slowly and kept them upright ever after. It began, "To whoever finds this," and Anna read it once through with her breath held, and then again with her hand pressed to the stone floor to keep herself steady, and then a third time aloud into the quiet of the dugout, so that the voice that had written it could be heard in the room where it had waited. The letter had been written by a woman named Priscilla Alden, who signed herself Prissy at the bottom, and who had lived in the cabin below the ice for 22 years before the beaver works on the creek above gave out in a spring thaw and turned the meadow into a lake in the span of a single afternoon. She had been a seamstress. She had raised one daughter alone after her husband was killed on a rail crew west of the ridge, and she had taught that daughter to sew straight, to bake plain bread, and to keep a level head under a slow-spoken man. The blue thread she had bought by the spool in a dry goods store in Willow Hollow the summer her daughter turned 12, and had used for hems and samplers and mending shirt cuffs, and had given a good long length of it to the girl on the day she married a quiet stonecutter, passing through to lay foundations. The stonecutter's name, Prissy had written on the second page, was Thomas. Anna folded the letter along its old creases and put it inside the account book with the wedding photograph, and she sat a while longer on the slate floor with her hand flat on the stone. Then she stood, brushed her skirt, and began. She spent that first night in the dugout with the tin box beside her, and the door hung shut against the wind by the coil of tarred twine, and in the morning she walked back into Willow Hollow with the folded map and one gold half-eagle in her coat pocket. At the county recorder's office, she paid the small fee to have her father's transfer entered against her name, and she asked the clerk, a slight man in a green eyeshade, to write her out a fresh survey certificate she could show to anyone who might wonder. He did, and he did not charge her for the second copy. At the general store, she bought a wedge steel axe, a two-man crosscut saw with a spare tooth file, a claw hammer, a keg of cut nails, a pound of tallow, 6 panes of window glass wrapped in flannel, a small tin stove with 2 lengths of pipe, a bag of dried apples, a bag of beans, a side of bacon, and 2 wool blankets. She spent $42.11 and had the storekeeper hold half the goods for a wagon. The storekeeper's name was Owen Beecham, 49 years old, a widower with grown daughters in the next county, who had known her father in the years before Anna, and who did not say so at first. He asked her name twice, wrote it into his ledger in a slow round hand, and told her that if she meant to hold that lake through the spring, she would need a man with a wagon and a strong team, and that he knew where to find one. The man was Isaiah Pohl, 36, a freighter with 2 mules and a flatbed, who charged her $1 a load and threw in his back and his shoulders for free because Owen had asked. Isaiah hauled the stove up to the dugout in one trip and the lumber and provisions in the next, and on the second trip he brought his wife, Margaret Pohl, 33, a laundress with red hands and a quick eye, who looked at the dugout once and said only, "You'll want a proper floor before winter closes it up again." Margaret came back the following week with her brother, a carpenter named Rye Halloran, 28, who set the slate even, laid a plank subfloor over it against the damp, and pinned the timbers where they had begun to sag, taking his pay in coin and in a promise of a share of the ice come summer. Anna hired a boy from a farm 2 miles up the creek, Wesley Ames, 14, to clear the bramble off the front of the dugout and the deer path down to the shore, and she paid him 10 cents a day and a hot dinner cooked on the little stove. Word went along the road that a girl was working the North Lake, and by the end of the second week, she had visitors most afternoons. A woman named Hannah Doss, 61, who ran the boarding house on the main street, and who brought a jar of stewed pears. A blacksmith named Peter Vetch, 42, who mended the hinges of a door Rye had hung and would not take her coin. And the lawyer from the outside staircase, who came out one Saturday with his spectacles pushed up and stood a long time looking at the shape beneath the ice before he said only, "Your father paid that tax every year." Anna said she knew. He said, "He knew you would come to it." By the first true thaw at the end of March, the dugout had a fitted door with iron hinges, a plank floor, 2 shelves lined with new crocks, a small stove that drew clean, and a bunk built into the eastern wall on which Anna slept under both her wool blankets and the sampler unfolded and pinned to the timber above her head. She kept the compass in a nail-hung pocket by the door and the tin box, empty of coin now, beneath the bunk with Prissy Alden's letter folded inside it. She had spent a portion of the found money on tools and a portion on labor, and she had put the remainder, $63 and a handful of dimes, into the same drawstring pouch that had once held only 38, and she kept it under the loose stone at the head of the bunk, the way Prissy had kept hers. When the ice began to soften in the middle first, and to hold at the shore, Anna hired Isaiah's team again and rigged a set of drag hooks and a windlass on the eastern point above the drowned cabin. With Rye Halloran on the rope and Wesley Ames handling the mules and Isaiah in a flat-bottomed boat borrowed from a fisherman up the creek, they raised the 4 dressed stones from the south wall over 3 long days, then the chimney stones one by one, then the ridgepole, then the door frame with the door itself still hung on its wooden pegs, and they laid every piece in careful order along the shore to dry. Peter Vetch came out and forged new hinges. Margaret Pohl brought a pot of navy beans and stayed to sort nails. Owen Beecham drove out with a fresh keg of cut nails and stood on the shore with his hat off, while the ridgepole came up out of the water still bearing the notch where Thomas had cut it. And he said, without looking at Anna, that her father had learned to notch a ridgepole in this valley when he was younger than she was now. Through May and June, Anna and Rye and Wesley laid a new foundation on the eastern point, 20 feet above the summer waterline, and they set the salvaged stones back into it with fresh mortar in the old order. Thomas's cut stones on the south, the chimney on the west, the door frame facing east across the water. They raised new timber walls of standing pine from the ridge behind, and they roofed it in split shakes cut by Rye's own hand. The cabin was finished by the middle of August. It was 1 room, 16 by 20, with a stone hearth, 2 glass windows, a plank floor, and a lean-to on the west for a milk goat Hannah Doss had given her out of a nanny's second kidding. In September, Anna filed a further paper at the county office, entering her homestead intent on the shore acres above the survey line, and by the time the leaves turned, she had a claim on both the water and the ground. The county assessor rode out to look, walked the line with her, wrote in his book, and told her the parcel was called on the old map the Alden place. He asked if she wanted the name changed. She said no. That winter she cut ice from the lake in 12-inch blocks with Isaiah and Rye, packed it in sawdust in a new stone ice house dug into the bank beside the dugout, and sold it through the summer to the boarding house, the butcher, the 2 saloons, and the hotel on the main street. She kept a ledger in the account book Hetty had once made her keep, wrote clean receipts in a round, upright hand, and signed each of them Anna Mercer, Alden Place, Willow Hollow. By her second spring on the lake, The people on the main street knew her by name and by the sound of Isaiah's wagon coming in with her ice, and the children on the creek road called her Miss Anna and ran alongside the wheels. On an evening in late June of that second year, Anna sat on the step of the cabin with the door open behind her and the lake going flat and pink under a low sun. The goat was tied at the corner of the lean-to and had lain down. A pot of beans was warming on the stove inside. The sampler was pinned to the timber above the bunk, the two words in blue thread showing clean against the pale wood, and the account book lay open on the table with the day's receipts drying under a river stone she had carried up from the shore herself. She had come outside because the light was worth stopping for, and because she wanted to look once more, before dark, at the water where the cabin had been. The shape was gone from beneath the ice because the ice was gone, and the drowned rooms were gone from the lake bed because she had raised them stone by stone and set them behind her on the point. What lay under the water now was only water, and the water was hers. She could see from where she sat the 4 dressed stones her father had cut set into the south wall of the cabin at her back, and the chimney of Prissy Alden's set stone going up the west end, and the door frame with its old wooden pegs facing east across the lake exactly as it had faced east from the bed of the lake for all the years before she had come. Anna took the compass from the nail-hung pocket by the door and held it in her palm the way she had held it in the lawyer's office, and the way she had held it kneeling on the ice, and the needle settled and pointed north, as it had always done. She thought of her mother, whose face she could not remember, who had carried this brass and this scratched glass in a pocket against her ribs before Anna was old enough to know her. She thought of Hetty, who had sat her at a kitchen table for 6 winters and told her she was the steady kind, and who had made her keep the account book that now held the day's receipts and Prissy Alden's letter folded inside it. She thought of her father, who had cut those 4 stones on the south wall in a valley he would not name to her, and who had paid the small yearly tax on a frozen lake for every year of her life without telling her why, and who had held the empty tin box on his knees and wept, and who had said only, "Willow Hollow, girl, only Willow Hollow," because he did not know how to say the rest of it and had trusted her to find it. She thought of the lawyer's file, which said the parcel was clear. She thought of Hetty's nephew in the East, who had sold a herd and boarded a house he had never lived in, and who did not know her name. She thought of the men in the county who had passed the lake for years and called it useless. She went inside and took the tin box from beneath the bunk and set it on the table beside the account book. From the account book, she took Prissy Alden's letter and laid it on the oilcloth folded inside the box. From the inner pocket of her coat, she took the compass and laid it beside the letter. She stood a moment with her hand on the wood. Anna Mercer was 20 and had been left nothing. She had $38 to her name and a brass compass in her coat, and she had spent the $38 on the road to a frozen lake at the far edge of Willow Hollow that no one in the county wanted. It was the best $38 she ever spent. The lake was hers, and the ground above it was hers, and the cabin on the point was hers, and the name on the old map was Alden Place, and she had not changed it, because 2 women she had never met had already loved her enough to leave her everything she needed to begin. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and to share it with someone who has ever been handed what looked like nothing and been told to make do. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, and tell us the name of the person in your own life who saw you clearly before anyone else did. The mentor, the grandmother, the neighbor, the quiet parent, the friend who taught you a skill you still use. And ask yourself this before you close the window tonight. What has been sitting in your life, frozen over and passed by? That might be the one thing you were meant to inherit. Sit with that question, the way Anna sat on her step in the long pink light, and see what rises up beneath the ice.